They uncovered a relic from a dead civilization. It awakened the moment a human entered Part 5, the New Dawn one. Standard year had passed since the Remembering, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. And now, the greatest gathering of species in Concord history assembled on the station called Harmony Prime to decide the fate of humanity. Alara stood in a waiting room and adjusted the simple uniform she had chosen to wear and thought about how far she had come from that frozen world where she had first touched an ancient monolith and awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. The door opened and President Oze entered, and her face was calm, but her eyes carried the same weight that every human wore now, and she said, "They are ready for us, and the chamber is full, and every major species sent their highest representatives, and they are afraid. Commander and I can smell it even from here. Fear makes people dangerous." Alara replied, and she straightened her shoulders. "But it also makes them honest, and we will use that honesty today." They walked together through corridors filled with alien beings who stared at them with expressions ranging from terror to wonder to carefully hidden hope, and Alara met every gaze without flinching because she had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. The great chamber of Harmony Prime had been built to hold 10,000 beings, and today it was full to overflowing. As representatives from every corner of the galaxy gathered to witness this moment, at the center of the chamber a speaking platform waited, and around it rose tiers of seats filled with crystalline, Veluxian amphibian Thorani and insectoid Krath, and gaseous Velm, and dozens of other species that Alara now recognized from inherited memories as beings her ancestors had once ruled or allied with. Or conquered. Kristlek Shenvoth stood at the front of the Veluxi delegation, and his body flickered with colors that Alara could now read as complex emotions, and he watched her approach with something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. The elder speaker of the Concord was a Veln whose name translated roughly as flowing wisdom, and they drifted forward in their containment field, and their voice resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. "We are gathered to address the matter of humanity, and to decide whether they shall be admitted to the Concord as full members, or whether restrictions shall be placed upon them for the safety of all other species and the human delegation may now speak." Alara walked to the speaking platform and looked out at the sea of alien faces and took a deep breath and began to speak in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "1 year ago, I touched a relic from a dead civilization, and I awakened something that had been waiting for my species for 2 million years, and I made a choice that changed everything, and I stand before you today to answer for that choice." The chamber was silent, and every eye and sensor and perception organ was focused on her. "You are afraid of us," she continued, and her voice was steady and calm. "And you should be, and I do not say this to threaten you, but to acknowledge the truth that sits between us like a wall, and you have every right to fear what we might become." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Alara let them fade before she continued. "The Remembering showed us what our ancestors were, and it was glorious and it was terrible. And we carry both of those things inside us now, and we remember the cities of light and the ships that sailed between galaxies, and the power that could reshape reality itself." She paused, and her voice grew heavy with sorrow. "But we also remember the slaves and the conquered worlds and the wars that burned across the stars, and we remember the moment when our ancestors looked at what they had become and chose to destroy everything rather than let the empire continue." Shenvoth made a sound like distant chimes, and Alara saw something shift in his crystalline form as he leaned forward to listen more closely. "You want guarantees," Alara said, and she swept her gaze across the assembled species. "You want oversight and restrictions, and the right to control what we do and what we build, and how we use the knowledge that has returned to us." The elder speaker drifted closer, and their voice rumbled with authority as they said, "The Concord must protect its members, and humanity has shown, in just 1 year, that they possess capabilities that dwarf anything we have achieved in millennia, and we would be fools to ignore. The threat you represent, you would be fools to ignore it, yes. Ilara agreed, and her response surprised many in the chamber. But you would also be fools to think that restrictions and oversight would make any difference if we truly wanted to conquer you. The chamber erupted in angry voices and frightened sounds, and Ilara waited for the noise to die down before she continued. We do not want that, she said, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. And this is what you fail to understand, and this is why your fear blinds you to the truth. She stepped forward to the very edge of the platform and spread her hands wide. We were gods once, and we chose to be mortal again because godhood made us cruel, and now we remember what we were, and more importantly, we remember why we stopped, and that memory lives in every human mind like a scar that will never heal, and we will carry the shame of our ancestors forever. The chamber had gone quiet again, and Ilara felt tears on her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away because they were part of her truth. In the past year, humanity has shared every technology we recovered freely with any species that asked, and we have defended 3 border systems from scourge incursions without asking for payment or territory or gratitude. And we have sent aid to 7 worlds that suffered disasters without expecting anything in return. She looked at Shenvoth, and the Veluxi scholar met her gaze without flinching. We are not asking for your trust, because we know we have not earned it yet, and we may not earn it in my lifetime, or my children's lifetime, or in 10 generations. But we are telling you that we will earn it eventually, and we will keep earning it until the galaxy forgets why it was ever afraid of us. She drew herself up to her full height and spoke the words that would echo through history. And then we will keep earning it anyway, because that is who we choose to be, and that is the only promise we can make, and that is the only promise worth making. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then Shenvoth rose from his seat, and his crystalline form blazed with light as he spoke in his chiming voice. The Veluxi vote to admit humanity to the Concord as full members without restrictions. Shock rippled through the chamber, and Kethral surged forward and demanded to know why, and Shenvoth turned to face his fellow Concord members with calm certainty, because they destroyed themselves rather than become tyrants once before, and because they carry the memory of that choice in their very cells, and because any species capable of that level of self-sacrifice deserves the chance to prove they can do better. One by one, the other species voted, and the result was closer than Ilara had hoped, but in the end it was enough, and humanity was admitted to the Galactic Concord as full members, without restrictions. As Ilara left the chamber, she received one final message from Veloth 9, where the custodian had remained dormant since the activation of the axiom. Kiva's ancient voice spoke one last time before falling silent forever, and its words were meant for her alone. The architects wondered if you would rise with vengeance or with wisdom, and they wagered on wisdom, and it appears they won. And may you continue to prove them right, young one, and may the second dawn of humanity burn brighter than the first. Ilara smiled through her tears and walked out into a galaxy that was learning to hope, and she carried the weight of 2,000,000 years of history on her shoulders and the light of a second chance in her heart, and humanity took its place among the stars, not as conquerors returned, but as survivors, reborn, carrying the memory of what they were and the choice of what they would become. The drill broke through the final layer of frozen stone, and Commander Ilara Vance felt the vibration stop beneath her boots as the massive machine powered down, and the excavation team held their breath in the sudden silence that followed. 3 years of endless noise. She stood at the edge of the pit on a world called Veloth 9, where no sun had shone warmly for 100,000 years, and where the sky burned with the dim red glow of a dying star that would collapse into darkness within another 1,000,000 years. Behind her, the crystalline forms of the Veluxi scholars shifted and clinked as they moved closer to see what the drill had uncovered, and beside them, the Thorani engineers checked their equipment with their webbed fingers. While water dripped from their amphibian skin in the cold, dry air, the Galactic Concorde had sent this joint expedition to find answers about the architects, and now after 3 years of digging through ash and ice and the bones of a dead world, they had finally reached the inner sanctum. Crystal Shenvoth glided forward, and his body caught what little light existed and scattered it into rainbows across the dark stone as he spoke in his chiming voice that always reminded Ilara of wind. Through glass, the chamber is breached, and we must proceed with extreme caution as the architects left traps and other sites that killed entire teams before anyone understood the danger. Ilara nodded and pulled up the readings on her wrist display and frowned at what she saw because every scanner showed nothing but emptiness below, even though the ground-penetrating radar had clearly shown a massive structure. The Thorani lead engineer, whose name was Kethral, made a gurgling sound of confusion and adjusted his equipment and tried again, but the readings remained blank, as if the chamber below simply did not exist. "This is impossible," he said, and his throat sac inflated with frustration. "The structure is there, and we can see the opening, but our instruments say there is only void, and this has never happened before." Shenvoth made a sound like shattering crystal, which Ilara had learned was the Veluxi equivalent of a thoughtful hum, and he consulted with his fellow scholars in their own language before turning back to the group. "We will send a probe first, and then evaluate the results before any living being enters that place." They lowered a drone into the darkness and watched its feed on a shared display as it descended through the opening and into a chamber so vast that the drone's lights could not reach the walls, and there in the center of that impossible darkness sat something that made Ilara's heart skip a beat. A monolith of metal that seemed to drink the light. Rather than reflect, it rose from the floor and reached toward an unseen ceiling, and its surface was covered in script that shifted and changed whenever the drone's camera tried to focus on it directly. The scholars made sounds of awe and fear and excitement all mixed together as they watched the feed, and Kethral's instruments still showed nothing at all, as if the monolith was a ghost or a dream that only their eyes could see. 2 million years. Shenvoth whispered in a voice like cracking ice. 2 million years since the architects vanished, and we have finally found something they left behind, and it is beautiful. And it is terrifying. Ilara studied the monolith on the screen and felt something strange stirring in her chest, like a memory she could not quite reach or a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to come, and she did not understand why this dead artifact affected her so deeply. The expedition spent 3 days studying the chamber from above and sending more drones and taking readings that showed nothing and arguing about what to do next, while Ilara grew more restless with each passing hour. The cheer. Veluxi wanted to wait for more experts to arrive from the core worlds, but that would take months, and Ilara knew that the Concorde's funding for this mission was running out, and that if they did not produce results, soon the whole project would be shut down. The 4th day she made her request, and the aliens looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You want to enter the chamber yourself," Shenvoth said, and it was not a question. "You want to walk into a space that our instruments cannot see and approach an artifact built by beings who could reshape reality itself, and you want to do this alone. Your biology reacts to the residual radiation in there." Ilara replied and kept her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "The Thorani would suffer cellular damage within minutes, and your crystalline structure would develop fractures from the exotic particles. And I am the only one here who can survive long enough to get a proper visual record." Kethral made a bubbling sound that meant reluctant agreement and said, "She is correct, and the human tolerance for hostile environments is far greater than our own, and we have always known this, even if we do not like to admit it." The debate continued for another 2 days, but in the end, they had no choice, and Ilara suited up and checked her equipment and prepared to descend into the darkness alone. She rappelled down through the opening and her boots touched the floor of the chamber, and the cold bit through her suit as she activated her helmet lights and looked up at the monolith that towered above her. Script on its surface was still now, and she could almost read it, and she stepped closer without meaning to, as if something was pulling her forward, and her hand reached out toward the dark metal. And the moment her fingers touched the surface, the entire chamber exploded with light channels in the floor and walls and ceiling that no one had seen blaze to life with golden fire, and the script on the monolith burned bright enough to blind, and Elara stumbled backward and threw up her arm to shield her eyes. Above her, she could hear the aliens screaming in their own languages, and the sound of equipment crashing as they scrambled away from the opening. But she could not move because a voice was speaking now, and it was coming from everywhere at once, and it was speaking in perfect English with no accent and no hesitation, as if it had been waiting to say these words for longer than human civilization had existed. Finally, the voice said, and it was warm and ancient and filled with something that sounded almost like relief. "One of you came, and I have waited so long, and now at last I can fulfill my purpose." Elara's legs gave out beneath her, and she sat on the cold floor and stared up at the blazing monolith and whispered, "What are you?" The light dimmed enough for her to see, and the voice answered with words that would change everything she thought. She knew about humanity and its place in the universe. "I am the custodian, and I was built to wait for your kind, and today my wait is over." The chamber pulsed with golden light as Elara pushed herself to her feet and stared at the monolith that had just spoken to her in her own language, and her mind raced to understand what was happening. Above her, the voices of the Veluxi and Thorani echoed down through the opening as they argued about whether to pull her out or flee entirely, or call for military support from the nearest Concord outpost. But Elara could not look away from the burning script that covered the ancient structure, and she asked the question that screamed inside her head. "How do you know English? And how do you know about humans? And we have only been traveling the stars for 200 years, and the architects vanished 2 million years before we even existed." The custodian's voice filled the chamber again, and it was gentle in a way that reminded Elara of her grandmother telling stories by the fire on cold winter nights back on Earth. "You asked the wrong question, young one, and you assume things that are not true, and you have forgotten so much that you do not even know how much you have forgotten." Crystalard Shenvoth appeared at the edge of the opening above, and his crystalline body flickered with agitation as he called down to her with fear in his chiming voice. "Commander Vance, you must evacuate immediately, and we do not know what that thing is capable of, and we cannot protect you from here." But Elara held up her hand to silence him and kept her eyes fixed on the monolith and said, "Tell me what you mean, and tell me what we have forgotten." The light in the chamber shifted, and images began to form in the air around her like holograms made of golden fire, and she saw things that made no sense at first: cities floating between stars, and ships that moved through dimensions instead of space, and beings that looked human, but wore crowns of light and spoke words that reshaped reality itself. "Your people are not young," the custodian said, as the images swirled around Elara like a hurricane of impossible history. "Your people are old, and so old that when my makers walked the stars, your ancestors had already risen and fallen and forgotten themselves completely." Elara shook her head and refused to believe what she was hearing and said, "That cannot be true, because we evolved on Earth, and we have fossil records and DNA evidence, and we know our history. You know your second history." The custodian replied, and the images changed to show a small blue world covered in ice and primitive creatures huddling in caves. "You know the story of humans who crawled out of the darkness and learned to walk upright and discovered fire and built cities and reached for the stars. And you think this is the beginning, but it is not the beginning. And it is a second chance." The Veluxi scholars had descended halfway down the chamber walls now, and they clung to the ancient stone, and listened with their whole bodies vibrating as the custodian continued to speak. My makers were called the architects by those who came after them, and they were powerful beyond your current understanding, and they could fold space and reshape matter, and touch the minds of living things across galaxies, and they thought they were the first to achieve such wonders. The images show beings of impossible beauty and power moving through the cosmos and building structures that span solar systems, and creating life on barren worlds just because they could. But in their final centuries, before they chose to transcend physical form and move beyond this reality, they discovered something that shattered their pride and humbled them completely. Alara watched as the golden images showed the architects finding ancient ruins on a dead world very much like this one, and she felt a chill run down her spine as she understood what was coming. They found evidence of your people, the custodian said, and the images showed human forms carved in stone that was older than the architects themselves. They found the echoes of a civilization so vast and so ancient that it made the architects look like children playing with toys, and they realized that humanity had walked among the stars when the architects' ancestors were still swimming in primordial seas. Kethril made a sound of pure disbelief from somewhere above, and his voice cracked as he said, "This is madness. And humans are the youngest species in the Concord, and they have barely mastered faster than light travel, and they could not have built an empire before the architects." But Shenvoth was silent, and his crystalline form had gone very still, and Alara remembered that the Veluxi were master historians and that their oldest records spoke of beings called the First Ones who existed before all other life and who vanished so completely that most scholars thought they were myths. The architects studied what they found. The custodian continued, and the images showed them piecing together fragments of impossible history. And they learned that humanity's first empire had spanned galaxies and had lasted for eons, and had achieved things that even the architects could not replicate, and then it had ended. How? Alara whispered, and her voice was barely audible. How did it end? The images turned dark and showed fire and destruction and worlds burning and stars going out one by one, and Alara felt tears running down her cheeks without knowing why. They chose to end it themselves, the custodian said, and there was something like sorrow in its ancient voice. Your ancestors looked at what they had become, and they were horrified, and they decided that they would rather die than continue, and so they burned their own empire to ash and scattered the survivors across the cosmos and erased their own memories so completely that they forgot they had ever been anything more than animals. Alara fell to her knees as the weight of this revelation crushed her, and she understood now why the monolith had activated for her, and why it spoke her language, and why it had waited so long. You were built for us, she said, and the words came out broken and raw. The architects built you to wait for us to come back. Yes, the custodian replied, and the golden light grew warm and gentle around her. My makers recognized what your people carried within them, and they called it the first flame, and they said it was the original spark of conscious will that lit the universe. And they knew that you would rise again someday, and they wanted to help you remember. Above her, the aliens had gone completely silent, and Alara could feel their fear and their awe and their sudden terrible understanding that everything they thought they knew about humanity was wrong. She looked up at the monolith and asked the question that would change everything. What did you wait all this time to give us? And the custodian answered with words that would echo through history. I waited to give you a choice, and the choice is whether you want to remember what you were, or whether you want to keep forgetting, and the decision, young one, is yours alone to make. 3 days had passed since the custodian spoke its first words, and the excavation site had transformed into something between a diplomatic crisis and a religious awakening as ships from across the Concord arrived in orbit above Velith 9. Alara had not left the chamber, and she sat against the wall and stared at the monolith and tried to understand the weight of the choice that had been placed in her hands. while above her, the greatest minds of a dozen species argued about what should. Leidon the custodian had shown her the axiom key, and it floated now in a beam of golden light at the center of the chamber, and it was small enough to fit in her palm and beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, and it contained the power to change everything. The key does not simply advance your technology, the custodian had explained in its patient ancient voice. It awakens the sleeping memory that your ancestors buried within your very cells, and it will show your people what they once were and what they chose to forget. Crystal Arch Shenvoth descended into the chamber again, and his crystalline form caught the golden light and scattered it into patterns that danced across the walls as he approached Alara with careful movements. The Concord High Council has reached a decision, he said, and his voice was strained with tensions she could only imagine. They believe the key should be taken to a secure facility and studied before any activation is considered, and they want you to surrender it to a joint scientific committee. Alara laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the ancient space. And she said, "The custodian already told me that won't work, and the key responds only to human DNA and to human intention, and no one else can even touch it without it going dormant." Shenvoth made a sound like grinding glass that meant frustration and said, "Then we request that you delay any decision until the full implications can be analyzed, and Council fears what humanity might become if you recover the knowledge of your ancestors." From above, Cathrall called down with anger bubbling in his amphibian voice and said, "The Thorani delegation agrees with the Council, and we have seen what happens when young species gain power too quickly, and they become conquerors and tyrants, and they destroy everything they touch." Alara stood and faced the Veloxi scholar and kept her voice calm even though anger burned in her chest, and she said, "Young species, and is that what you still think we are after everything the custodian revealed?" "What? You were is not what you are now," Shenvoth replied, and his tone was not unkind, but it carried a warning. "The humans we know are brilliant and adaptable and resilient, yes, but you are also reckless and violent, and you have nearly destroyed yourselves a dozen times in just the 2 centuries since you achieved space travel, and the Council wonders if perhaps your ancestors were right to forget." The words hit Alara like a physical blow, and she turned away from him and looked at the axiom key floating in its beam of light. And she thought about everything she knew about human history. The wars and the genocides and the empires built on blood and the weapons that could crack planets and the endless capacity for cruelty that seemed woven into her species like a genetic curse. But she also thought about the other things, and the art and the music and the love and the stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost, and the way humans kept reaching for something better, even when they kept falling short. "The custodian," she said without turning around, "I have a question for you." "Ask," the ancient voice replied, and it filled the chamber with warmth. "What did my ancestors become? And why did they choose to destroy themselves rather than continue, and what were they so afraid of?" The golden light dimmed slightly, and when the custodian spoke again, there was something heavy in its voice like grief carried across millions of years. "Your ancestors built an empire that stretched across multiple galaxies, and they lived for thousands of years, and they could create life with a thought and destroy stars with a word, and they were magnificent beyond description." The images formed again in the air, and Alara saw humans who looked like gods walking through cities of light and shaping reality itself with their bare hands. But power corrupts, the custodian continued, and the images darkened. "And absolute power corrupts absolutely, and your ancestors began to see themselves as above all other life, and they enslaved the younger species, and they destroyed worlds that displeased them, and they waged wars against each other that shattered entire sectors of the galaxy." Alara watched her ancestors become monsters, and she felt sick to her stomach as she saw the things they had done in the name of progress and order and divine right. In the end, the custodian said, and the images showed a council of ancient humans gathered in a chamber not unlike this one. The wisest among them looked at what their people had become, and they made a choice, and they decided that it would be better to burn everything down and start over than to let the empire continue. They killed themselves. Alara whispered. They killed what they had become. The custodian corrected gently. They destroyed the technology and the knowledge and the memories, and they scattered the survivors across the cosmos, and they let them start over as primitives. And they hoped that next time humanity would choose a different path. Shenboth had been listening in silence, and now he spoke with something like awe in his crystalline voice and said, they destroyed an empire that spanned galaxies rather than let it become a force for evil, and that is either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever heard. Alara turned to face him, and she felt tears on her cheeks. But her voice was steady when she spoke. The Concord is afraid that we will become what we were, and they want to keep us contained and controlled and manageable, because they think power will corrupt us again. Yes, Shenvoth admitted, but you are missing the point, Alara said, and she walked toward the Axiom Key and reached out her hand toward its light. We already forgot once, and we already fell, and we already crawled back up from nothing, and we can choose what we become this time. She looked at the Veluxi and the Thorani watching from above, and she made her decision. I accept the key, she said, and her fingers closed around it, and golden light exploded through the chamber, and through her body, and through the very fabric of space itself. And across the galaxy, every human alive felt something awaken inside them like a fire that had been waiting to burn. The pulse traveled faster than light itself, and it moved through dimensions that had no names, and it found every human being in the galaxy, no matter where they hid, and it touched them all at the same moment on Earth. A woman named Sarah Chen was walking her dog through a park in Beijing when she collapsed on the grass, and her mind flooded with images of cities that floated between stars and words in a language she had never learned, but somehow understood perfectly on Mars Colony 7. A miner named Marcus Webb dropped his drill and fell to his knees and wept as he remembered lives he had never lived and saw the faces of children who had died 1,000,000 years before he was born on a trading station at the edge of Concord space. A teenager named Yuki Tanaka screamed as the memories tore through her and showed her the glory and the horror of what her ancestors had been and what they had done. 11 billion humans scattered across hundreds of worlds all experienced this same thing at the same moment, and for 17 minutes, the entire species went silent as the remembering swept through them like a fire through dry grass, and then the screaming began. Hospitals overflowed with people who could not process what they had seen, and suicide rates spiked as some humans could not bear the weight of inherited guilt for atrocities committed by ancestors so distant they might as well be myths, and families gathered together and held each other and wept for things they had lost before they were ever born. But other things happened too on Earth. An engineer named David Park woke from the remembering and walked to his workshop and began drawing blueprints for a ship design that had not existed for 2 million years, but that now burned clear and perfect in his Minden. Titan, a physicist named Elena Vasquez, sat up in her hospital bed and spoke equations that made the doctors back away in fear, because they seemed to bend reality itself around her voice. On a dozen colony worlds, humans who had been farmers and teachers and shopkeepers began building things that no one in the modern age had ever imagined, because they remembered now, and the knowledge was flowing back like water through a broken dam. Galactic Concord watched in stunned silence as humanity transformed before their eyes. Within 3 weeks, the first new ships launched from human shipyards, and they were beautiful and terrible, and they moved through space in ways that made Concord. Scientists weep with confusion. Within 2 months, human diplomats began speaking to alien races with sudden understanding and recognizing patterns that no one had seen before, and recalling alliances that their ancestors had held with species whose Descendants still lived within 6 months. Humanity had advanced further than the Concord had managed in 10,000 years, and the fear that Shenvoth had warned about began to spread through every alien world. Ilara stood on the bridge of a ship called the Second Dawn and looked out at the stars and felt the weight of what she had unleashed pressing down on her shoulders. The custodian had warned her that the memories would be hard, and it had been right, but it had not told her how hard it would be to watch her people struggle with the truth. Report from Earth, our communications officer said, and his voice was steady, but his eyes carried shadows that had not been there before the remembering. The Unified Council has officially formed, and they want to speak with you, Commander. Ilara nodded, and the holographic image of 12 humans appeared before her, and she recognized the faces of leaders from every major nation and colony. And she saw that they too carried the weight of inherited memory in their eyes. Commander Vance, said the woman who led the council, and her name was President Amara Assay, and she had been a schoolteacher before the remembering, and now she led a species that was waking up to its own terrible past. We have received demands from the Concord, and they are threatening to impose restrictions on human expansion, and they want guarantees that we will not use our recovered knowledge for conquest. What do they specifically demand? Ilara asked. They want oversight committees on all human research. President Assay replied, and her voice was tired but firm. They want limits on our military capabilities, and they want the right to inspect any facility they choose, and they want us to submit to their authority in matters of galactic security. Ilara felt anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down because she understood where the fear came from, and she had seen what her ancestors had done, and she knew the Concord was not wrong to be afraid. What do our people want? She asked. The council members looked at each other, and President Assay spoke with something like wonder in her voice and said, "That is the strange thing, Commander, in the remembering did not make us want revenge or conquest, and it made us want to be better, and people are building schools and hospitals, and they are sharing technology freely with anyone who asks, and they are reaching out to the species their ancestors wronged and trying to make amends." One of the other council members, a man named Viktor Volkov, who had been a historian before he became a leader, spoke up and said, "The old empire fell because our ancestors became tyrants, and the memory of that fall is burned into every human mind now, and we carry the shame of it like a scar, and no one wants to repeat those mistakes." Ilara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she said, "Then we will tell the Concord that we understand their fear, and we will not submit to their authority, but we will prove through our actions that we are not what we were. They may not accept that," President Assay warned. "Then they will have to watch us earn their trust." Ilara replied, and she thought of what she had told Shenvoth in the chamber on Veloth 9. "We chose what we became once, and we can choose again, and this time we will choose to be worthy of the stars." The image of the council faded, and Ilara turned back to the viewport and watched the stars burn in the darkness, and she made a silent promise to her ancestors who had sacrificed everything to give humanity a second chance. "We will not waste it," she whispered to the ghosts of a dead empire. "We will make you proud this time." And across the galaxy, humanity continued to build and grow and reach for something better, while the Concord watched and waited and wondered what these strange reborn creatures would become.